It was several years ago, more than several years ago at this point, that we had 4 boys living in our home. And we were living in Ventura County, and when we wanted a little touch of culture, we had to bribe our children in order to go along with us. So, for example, this is when the Getty Museum, they didn't have the big $1.3 billion Getty Center in the Brentwood Hills off Skirball Avenue, but you had all the Getty collection in the Villa location in Pacific Palisades. And we'd love to go to that museum and just see some of the wonderful art of the world. And yet to get my kids to go was a bit of a drag. And so we would bribe them, as all good parents do, right? And so we asked them to come with us, and we said, you give us an hour at the museum, and we'll give you 3 hours surfing at Malibu Beach. Sounds like a good deal. And not only did they come and enjoy it, they also brought some of their friends at times, so we cultured some of their ne'er-do-well friends as well. And it was wonderful. I remember on one of the occasions, now this is when they had all the art collection there in that one location at the Villa, which is now only antiquities. But I was there in the Villa years ago, and I stood there looking at their piece that they own from Van Gogh called Irises. Have you seen that one? And I was just struck by the shapes, the colors, the designs. It's beautiful. It's amazing. I saw the dirt in the foreground, so intricately painted. And then these purple irises going in lots of directions. And then a single white blossom amidst them all. And I thought about how people respond to this painting. Some see that this painting that was done by Vincent van Gogh in 1889, just a month into his stay at an asylum, was a deep expression of sadness. Some look at this painting as a tremendous description of beauty and joy. Others see that it's joy in the midst of sadness. And I was just reflecting on this wonderful piece of art when my youngest son, Scott, who was in 5th grade at the time, comes up to me and he points to the frame around the piece of art and he said, "Now that's a cool looking frame." And ever since I had that experience, my son opened my eyes, actually, to the frames that pieces of art are placed in. Because I think that the owners of that piece of art are actually saying something about that piece of art with the frame they place around it. That is actually an expression of the owner's interpretation of the art with the selection of that frame. And I would say, as we consider once again these opening words from James in his letter to the churches in the ancient world, to Christians living in various places who are experiencing pains of a wide variety, he's actually inviting those Christians into the experience of placing a frame around some of those experiences that they have, many of them very distressing and negative. And he calls us to a faith in God in the midst of whatever experiences that we have. Now, last week we looked at this same text, and we looked at dimensions of those challenges that we face in life. Those challenges are inevitable, and we really can't avoid them. And there's so many challenges in our life that are unavoidable, and we simply can't anticipate them. And these challenges that we oftentimes have are variable. They come in many shapes and sizes, and we cannot plan for them. And yet, James is telling us, as we frame these experiences with an attitude of faith in God, then God can give us an opportunity to handle those challenges with grace, yes, with beauty, yes, and even with joy. And so I'd like to dig into the text today and look at it a little more deeply once again. And as we look at this, I love what James says in the 3rd verse of chapter 1. He says, "The testing of your faith produces perseverance." The King James translation says that our faith produces patience. Could anybody here use a little more patience? You see, these challenges that we have can actually produce patience. You know, I was working with some baseball coaches once, and they were saying that baseball doesn't really produce character, but what it does is it reveals your character. Well, I would say that that's kind of true with challenges that we experience in life too. It reveals our character, but it also helps produce our character. It's both, and so when you look at these challenges, James is telling us that these challenges actually are an opportunity for us to express patience, and also they produce patience at the same time. And I love the word testing. The testing of your faith produces patience. That word in other Greek settings in ancient antiquity is a word that refers to a purification process of precious metals. Testing is when you fire up the metals and it takes the impurities and puts them in one side, and then it takes the purities of the gold or the silver into another side. It's the same kind of word that Job uses of his experiences in the Old Testament. Job declares to God, "When God has tested me, I will come out as pure gold." You know, I've heard it said that our lives are kind of like a tea bag. You know, you put it in hot water and it reveals what's inside. And that's what happens with our lives. You know, we come under the heat and what's in us winds up coming out. And we also have an opportunity to grow in the midst of those challenges as well. And when we are put under the pressure, our lives can become an example to those around us, to our children, to our grandchildren, to our friends and neighbors, to fellow believers in our church community. Challenges are that kind of opportunity for us. Now, I was in a Bible study once years ago, and I do remember very clearly asking people to share with one another around the room experiences in their life that had helped shape them. And one of the persons, as we were beginning to share, said, "Now, do we have to share positive things or can they be negative things?" And I said, "Either." And it was interesting that when I gave people the permission to share either a negative thing or a positive thing that had impacted them in a profound way, most of the people shared negative things that were hardships at the time, but then had become life-shaping. And I would say that our challenges are that way for most of us. We have these significant challenges that are negative, but then as we learn to frame them with faith, they become something beautiful in our lives. And a couple things that James points out as he talks about the beauty that God is creating out of the challenges that we experience. He points out a couple that I'd just like to highlight today. One thing that this experience of faith produces is what I'd mentioned before, patience. It produces patience. And that word patience is, in the Greek, it refers to a staying with a person or staying in a situation when you're under extreme pressure. It's just like patiently hanging in there. And that's a hard thing to do, to just patiently hang in there when you feel like running. Ever feel like running? You run to the liquor cabinet, or you run to the TV set, or you run to some diversion, entertainment, sex, sports. You decompress with music, or you play a video game. Or if you're young, you go surfing, and if you're old, you surf the web. And we do these things, and we just kind of run from the problem with a little diversion. I was on the plane, and I was walking through the first class, and where it's all packed. I always walk through the plane when first class is already all packed. And everybody is, some people are well asleep by the time I'm loading onto the plane. I get the cheap tickets, and they let me on last. But this one time I was walking on the plane, there was this one guy in a business suit, and he was just sitting there, and he was like already at work. He had his coat hung up, he had his white starched shirt and a nice power red tie, and he was there working away at his computer, just clickety-clack, clickety-clack. And I was just so impressed with the work ethic of this guy. I thought he's probably some great CEO. And as I'm walking by, I just look back to see, what kind of, financial charts or projects he might be working on. And you know what he's doing? He's playing Pac-Man on his computer, that old video game he had somehow downloaded on his computer. Now, that's kind of cool to kind of decompress with Pac-Man, but if you play video games all day long, you know what you call that? Having no job, right? Unless your job is actually programming video games, which would kind of be cool. But if you go to work and you come home and you see the spouse, but then you go to the liquor cabinet first, or you go get the newspaper, or you turn on the TV, you know what you call that? No marriage. I mean, it might be a marriage in name, but it's not an intimacy of communication and of fellowship. And so we do have this tendency to run, to get away from, to do other things, to decompress. And what God is calling us into is into engagement and into patience with one another, where we frame the situation realizing that God is with us here for good and forever. And it makes a difference in how we can tend to the needs of a crying baby, or care to the needs of a hurting spouse, or respond to a situation that needs our attention. And as we go through these experiences, it reveals our patience, and it also develops our patience. And there's another thing that James tells us in the text, in addition to extending our patience, framing our life with a faith in God builds our character. James says it this way in verse 4, that faith enables us to be mature and complete, lacking nothing. I like the way that Paul says it in chapter 5 of Romans. He says, we know that suffering produces patience, and patience then produces character. It says basically the same thing as James. And then later in chapter 8 of Romans, Paul goes on to say, those whom God has chosen, God also set apart to become like children of God. And he's hitting on this theme that God is actually in the work of producing in us, through those challenges, the very character of God, so that we are like children of God. Think of it, being a child of God, like Jesus. Maturity comes as we let God shape our lives along the same lines as the life of Jesus Christ. And as we do this, and as this happens, we experience the same things in life that Jesus Christ experienced in his life. And then we increasingly begin to respond to life's challenges like Jesus. So let me ask you this. Are you in some struggles right now? Are you facing some decisions? Are you in a relational test? Are you having a hard time of getting out of yourself and framing situations with negativity? But can you maybe frame it in the positive love of Jesus Christ and faith in God and realize that God surrounds you? And God, who ultimately made you, is even now molding you and shaping you more into the image of Jesus Christ. That's what's happening when we experience challenges. You know, I have a friend whose daughter was getting married, and he and his daughter and his family invited me to do the wedding ceremony for them. Now, my friend was an ordained minister, and he could have done the wedding, but they wanted to have someone else perform the wedding and for my friend to be the father of the bride. But he did say a prayer for them. And I loved his prayer because his prayer reflected the fact that marriages sometimes have challenges. Have any of you experienced that? Does anybody believe that you say your marriage vows and you live happily ever after? No problems? Haven't seen a marriage like that yet. And so the prayer that he prayed really reflected that reality. And he prayed a prayer something like this. He said, God, we can't reasonably expect a problem-free life for this couple that we love so much. But God, please grant them the kind of problems that are going to shape each of them in character and mold their relationship to a place of grace and to a place where they will model peace and love in a turbulent world. Isn't that a beautiful prayer for a couple? And I think it's a good prayer for us to reflect in our life relationships and experience of challenges as well. It seems to me that this prayer really is seeking to frame that new relationship with faith. Not that we can avoid the inevitable. We can't even prepare for the unpredictable. And we certainly can't neutralize the intensity of things that are coming our way in variable ways. But we can frame our lives with faith, and then our lives can become more beautiful. Doing that really makes a difference. I really see this in the way people handle the experience of death, either the death of a loved one or the consideration of their own eventual dying. Years ago in my church in New Jersey, on the Jersey Shore, there was this man that passed away. And he was not a Christian. He did not go to church. None of his kids went to church. The grandkids didn't go to church. But one of the people in the family knew somebody in our church, and they asked me if I would come in to help this grieving family. And I did. And it was an honor to do so. But it was kind of an uphill battle with his family. Now, let me tell you about the man who died. He was 95. He ate bacon every morning for breakfast. He drank every day, and he smoked. And he lived to 95. Now, in my estimation, I'm thinking that's a pretty good run. But it was so interesting. Everybody seemed so utterly surprised that he died. I'm not kidding you. They were just absolutely shocked and in utter grief. And they had and he was a good guy. I heard about him. He was a good guy. But they opened up the casket. It was one of those where they wanted to look at their deceased loved ones, and they just looked in that casket, and I watched standing there at the head of that casket, the face on each person as they came by, and every person in that family had this look of hopelessness and despair. And my heart just went out for them. I was just hoping they could frame this distress and this grief with the love of Christ. And that was what I witnessed to them. But it's really something that we have to appropriate in our lives. I tell you, I've been to so many funerals in this church and in my whole ministry, and we Christians grieve, don't we? And it's very natural to grieve. But we do not grieve as those who have no hope. For we have a hope in one who surrounds us, who's with us and in us for good and forever. Now, one of the things I am just struck by in this text of James that I think is just utterly profound is this just whole idea that Christ is with us, God is with us in the midst of our sufferings. And there's a couple verses that echo this same thought in a very profound way and even spell it out even more graphically. Listen to the way Peter describes this in his first epistle, chapter 4. He says this, "Dear friends, do not be surprised by the fiery ordeals that come on you to test you, as though something is strange, and that this thing is so strange that's happening. But rejoice in so much as you participate in the suffering of Christ." Did you get that? We share the suffering of Christ. Paul says the same thing in Philippians 3, verse 10. He says, "I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own, but that which comes through faith in Christ, that I may know him and know the power of his resurrection, and that I may share in his sufferings, becoming like him." This is a profound truth that's being shared by the gospel writers, that we actually share the sufferings of Christ. Have you ever just pondered that? That when I'm suffering, it's not my suffering alone, but that Jesus is in me, suffering together with me, and I somehow am in Jesus, suffering with him. It's a profound thought. Now, that doesn't mean all suffering is sharing suffering with Christ. We reap infidelity, we reap dishonesty, we reap destructiveness, we reap conniving, and we sow a whirlwind, and we get our comeuppance, right? You reap what you sow. But sometimes we just suffer things that are inevitable and variable and unpredictable, and they hit us from all sides, and we don't know why, but Jesus is with us, and we share the sufferings of Christ. One of the greatest individuals to really capture the truth of this is actually a Jewish rabbi that I was reading several years back. Have you ever heard of Chaim Potok? He wrote the book, The Chosen. He also wrote a book called My Name is Asher Lev. Any of you read that book? Profound book. In the book, Asher Lev is an artist, and he creates a masterpiece, the crucifixion, the Brooklyn crucifixion is what it's called. And people are coming, swarms of people are coming from all around the world to see this wonderful masterpiece of Asher Lev. And then Asher Lev takes up the narration in the story about his life. And as Chaim Potok writes in the voice of Asher Lev in the book, Asher describes growing up in Brooklyn and how his father, a Hasidic Jew, is working in the 30s and 40s trying to get Jews out of Russia and Germany and move them into safe locations. And the son loves art, and the mother wants to encourage the son, but the father thinks it's frivolous. And the whole Hasidic community in Brooklyn thinks it's ridiculous for this child to spend his time painting. And yet the mother is just feeling this angst, knowing that God has somehow created her son to paint and to create these pieces of art. And she wants to help this boy fulfill God's purposes. And yet the father is saying no, and yet the mother is caught in between the two of them, and she's feeling this great pain. And the father goes off and lives in Vienna for a while doing his work, and he wants the mother and the son to come, but the mother wants the son to paint because this is how God has created him. And he gets this non-Hasidic Jew, but a Jew all the same, to help teach him to paint. And he goes and he studies art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Any of you been there before? It's a wonderful art museum with lots of art. And they have in this museum a whole sacred section of religious art. And Asher Lev just is gravitated to this image of the crucifix. And he takes his sketchboard and starts drawing, copying these images of Christ on the cross. And then he would start taking his paints and sit there and painting images of Christ on the cross. And then when it comes to his masterpiece, he finally does the Brooklyn crucifixion. And his parents are overseas, they haven't seen it, but then they come to the museum and they see this amazing piece of art that Asher Lev has created. And there they see this painting of Brooklyn. It's the hometown of Asher. It's the neighborhood where Asher grew up. It's the shops and the people and all the things going on that went on in Asher's childhood. And there, shadowing the whole image of Brooklyn, is the cross. And hanging on the cross is Asher's mother. And it seems to me that Chaim Potok understood that somehow his mother shared in the sufferings of Christ somehow for him. And Potok doesn't embrace the whole Christian faith, but I do think he gets that, and he illustrates it very powerfully. When we suffer, Christ is with us. Christ is in us. And Christ is for us for good and forever. Amen.